On this episode of the show, I have with me Anjali Jameson. She is Chief Product Officer at Arbiter, and we're going to be talking about the healthcare system, stakeholders, and the tension between them. Anjali's going to help us understand how sometimes they all don't align, and point solutions versus a holistic fix, and some other notions in there as well. We're going to talk about how misaligned incentives are potentially part of the problem, and we're going to ask how the technology and business are coming together to solve some of these, because I know a lot of people have questions always about the healthcare system. But Anjali, thanks for taking the time.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. All right. Before we start, can you tell us what Arbiter does?
Sure. So Arbiter is a care orchestration platform. And what that means is that we've built a platform that's essentially built for patients, providers, and payers together in one place versus a single point solution that would be solving needs of just one of those stakeholders. So we are basically, we have an operating spine that ingests and makes actionable data from across the patient journey, whether it's provider directories, EMR integrations, claims, even financial and policy data from health plans. And we do that, we create a single complete picture of the patient, but not just the patient, but the patient's ecosystem around them, the providers around them, how much things are going to cost, where procedures can be accessed. So we bring that all together and we connect that data spine to very highly personalized multi-channel agentic outreach. And so together we call that our care orchestration platform.
Absolutely. I guess going to take one small step back. When we talk about healthcare, I know people always have questions. I guess just from the onset, like your solution, what you just described, sounds like something that, we should be seeing readily available from the people that already have the information. Why do we need a solution if all our data is being held by people that could possibly help us get to this view, but we need apparently a third-party platform to bring that all together?
Well, there's a lot of organizations out there that are bringing data together, but usually in one place. So for example, there are the Epics of the world. They have all of the data for a given hospital system. You've got the payers of the world. They have all the data for a given member at the given time that member is a member. And then you have a number of other aggregators out there that are bringing data together. What we're trying to do is be cross-system, right? So a patient doesn't just stay with a single provider. They may use multiple providers, multiple health systems. They are cross-border. And so what we're trying to do is bring all of that data together about a patient and also the payer context, the health plan context. That's very, very important. So what does a given procedure cost for that individual patient? That's not necessarily housed in the EMRs. So it's very important that you bring that data together. There are other solutions out there that are trying to bring some of that data together. The difference is what you do with that data once you have it. And that's where we are more of an orchestration than just a data platform. We try to actually ensure that an action is taken from the data that we bring in.
Absolutely. I mean, that actually does help clarify. And you mentioned that there are various stakeholders, and there are things that each stakeholder wants, and sometimes not each stakeholder obviously sees eye to eye. I mean, there's a lot of different aspects. I know within the healthcare space, we could name. If you could also, as you go through this, tell us what each of those stakeholders do, because I think we hear a lot about them, but if you're not in the space, I feel like then it gets really confusing as the end consumer.
Yes, I think building health tech for as long as I have, it's pretty hilarious because, we may spend half a year building something really, really amazing for the patient or really, really amazing for the provider, and it may be in direct opposition to a different stakeholder in the mix. And so there is very misaligned incentives across the system. And I think probably anyone who's listening to this podcast right now will say that someone in their family, friend group, someone close to them or themselves has had some terribly negative experience within the healthcare system. Well, oftentimes that aligns right back to this misaligned incentives. So, for example, you have providers, and these are individual providers, as folks, clinical care folks in the system, and they want to practice at the top of their license. They want to be doing things throughout the day that makes the best use of all the education that they have. They want to avoid the frustrating administrative tasks. For example, they spend 12 to 14 hours per week just on prior authorizations alone. That is not practicing at the top of their license. That's working on the most mind-numbing parts of the healthcare system. And then they care about outcomes. They really do care that their patients are getting the best care and that they are taking care of their patients. And finally, they want to get paid well for what they do. They deserve to. They work really hard, and they deserve to be paid well for what they do. So you've got the providers there. Then you've got the hospital systems, and they are facing such significant cost pressure on all sides. So they want to make sure that they can lower their operational costs, and they need to manage some of the lowest margins out there. I mean, most hospital systems are operating at a 2 to 3% margin. And for rural and underserved hospitals, they're in the negatives. And so when they're looking at what they need from technology, they want to make sure that all of their highest value specialties like orthopedics, surgeries, they are fully utilized. They don't have surgeons just sitting there waiting to take care of patients, that they are fully utilized, and also that the patients that they are taking care of don't leak out into the system right at the point where they need those services. And then meanwhile, you have payers, health plans. And I think the number one thing they're thinking about is the lowering the cost of care, right? Which is nearly, if you look at the GDP, we're nearly at 20% of the GDP is healthcare costs. And payers are stuck with quite a bit of that. So, they care about lowering cost of care. They also care about value. So they're looking at health outcomes, quality metrics. So that's payers. And then finally, we're all patients. We can probably all guess what we want. We want access to a doctor who is empathetic and knowledgeable. We want a clear understanding of where to go when we want care. And then we want affordable care. We don't want to get a $1,000 bill in a month for, a 20-minute visit that we had. So they all seem very reasonable, but in action, they can work against each other.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think as you describe each of the stakeholders, as consumers, or as the end users of healthcare, we always don't see that. And I think, you mentioned, obviously, there's a lot of solutions out there, and there's a lot of people trying to solve particular pain points. When you look at something like this, where there is such conflicting interests, but yet everyone wants the best healthcare, which I think I really do believe everyone does ideally want the best. Now, what best is could mean different things here as well. So this could all go down a very slippery slope. But when you think about solutions to this problem, is this why a point solution is very hard, because you do have to then balance the rest of the books with the other stakeholders that are then not included in that type of solution?
I think point solutions are actually easier.
Easier. Makes sense.
This is why we're building what we're building. I think building a point solution, they're all hard to do, right? But point solutions solve for one customer. So if you're solving for one customer, you're going to have an easier time, because you have one customer, you have one set of use cases, you can sell to that one customer, there's a clear go-to-market, call and response from a product perspective, and you're solving that one thing for that end customer. So not that it's not hard, but it's more straightforward and a little bit more like, building products in other spaces. When you're trying to solve multiple stakeholder pain points in healthcare, you're going to get a much bigger bang for your buck from a total cost of care, metric and or star metric perspective, but it takes more work up front in contracting, in how you implement and how you configure and how you think about metrics. If you look at all the stakeholders, they all ultimately, the things that they want line up to total cost of care, but their secondary and primary, leading metrics to get there are different. So how do you build for those metrics while keeping total cost of care in your vision?
Absolutely. And I guess when you're looking at these multiple stakeholders, and obviously you said it's easier to have a point solution in place. When you're trying to be the backbone, the spine, how do you account for do all stakeholders have the same weight? Do you account for the fact that different stakeholders have different levels of participation? Because and the reason I ask this is, as the end consumer, I have a lot of at stake. I have the least to say in the process. Like, I don't have a ton of visibility. I don't have a ton of insights as to some of what's happening behind the scenes. Sometimes, depending on the health insurance policy, who I can go to, I feel like I'm actually maybe least in control, but maybe the person who's at the middle of all the stakeholders anyways.
It's so funny because I feel like no one feels like they have control across the stakeholders. They're trying, but they can't get it. I would say, I do think patients end up, bearing oftentimes the brunt of the misaligned incentives. And that's why if you build the right products, keeping in mind those stakeholders, you're going to have a much better time. And I can give an example if that would be helpful. So like if you think about, okay, here's a great example. Providers are increasingly tight on time, right? They see about 22 plus patients a day. And yet health systems have incredibly tight margins, like we talked about. So getting more patients in for care is critical. So right there, you have that misaligned incentive, right? So one of the products that we are out there in the market with is, how do you get those patients in for care, but you do it in a way that solves pain points for both the provider and the health system? So for example, many patients respond better to long form kind of care conversations, right? Especially some of the older Medicare patients. So we deploy agentic technology that sends long form back and forth personalized videos. So these folks can have a conversation. We can pre-deal with things like transportation, education, medication management ahead of time for the patient. So then the provider is doing less of those kind of upfront pieces. The patient is happier and more informed, and the health plan still gets to, the health system still gets the number of appointments that they need per day in order to meet their margin needs. So you can do all of that if you build out the technology in the right way.
Interesting. You mentioned building out the technology, and you referred to an agentic component. I guess when we're looking at this, at these solutions, and we're thinking about agentic, I've talked to a number of people that are talking about the automation of a lot of claims processing are being done by agents, that they are a lot more automated than they were. I even notice, I see my healthcare provider tell me, give me feedback within hours, if not a day. I don't wait 3-4 weeks anymore, which I've noticed that somewhere behind the scenes we're seeing something happening. When you're thinking about agentic, what are the use cases where an agent does something? And the reason I ask that is when we hear about agentic these days, people have a lot of wild ways of thinking how agents are going to impact our life. But I think this is a very tangible, solution for the system, the healthcare system. And it's actually going to do things that maybe are going to move the needle without us even ever really noticing.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's so many things that agentic AI can do that even 2 years ago we were struggling to figure out how to do. So I think the possibilities are pretty broad. I would say that I believe that we are moving towards automation of a ton of the administrative back office, from, for example, prior authorization, being able to ingest and codify raw policy documents, and then being able to automatically match patients' clinical data against rules in real time. I mean, moving prior authorization from 3 to 6 days to almost instantaneous. So that's an example. And that, when it's done, it will be ideally done, and we'll have that available, and we'll have that available across multiple different parts of the health tech space. And I think a lot of solutions are trying to solve some of those problems. I think one of the more interesting areas that we're tackling at Arbiter is that it's one thing to automate, but automating something that's broken is not going to necessarily give us better outcomes. And that is especially true with anything in the behavioral economic space, meaning we might be able to automate our requests for appointments or scheduling or patient education or anything that where we're requiring and asking a patient to do something. But if we're just automating what we already had before, we're not going to get better results. We'll automate it, so we'll operationally lower costs, but it's not going to fundamentally change action. And so there's a lot of work we're doing on how do you say what you want to say? When do you say it? Who says it, right? Like, there's patients that want to see a doctor in a white coat telling them exactly what to do, very paternalistic. There's other patients who are like, send me a text. I want it to be in like 5 seconds or less, and I want you to tell me the 3 appointments available, and I don't even need more than that. And so how do you make sure that what we're doing to get people to take the action, get the education, whatever it is that we need to do in order to improve their care quality, can happen? And that is not just an automation problem, that's an optimization challenge.
I like that quite a bit, because I think you mentioned not automating what was broken before. And I think the reason I like that is we're hearing a lot about business workflows and business processes that they have to be, we're going to see agentic take them over. I'm actually of the mind, I go, yes, that's fine. I think agents can take them over. Taking them over and not automate what was broken is probably a very hard thing to do, because it's going to be very easy for us to take what we had and just map it into something else. When you look at that as to you didn't want to actually map what was broken, I mean, again, stereotypically, the industry within healthcare, fragmented, some places are older, some places are newer, it's all, you know, lots of legacy data, lots of different systems. That almost seems like a needle, a stack of, looking for that needle within a stack of, a needle type of, you know, analogy. When you guys went about this, and maybe even currently, I mean, maybe, I don't know how frequently you look at this, but how do you start looking at not just automating what was broken? Because I think it's a lot easier just to say that, but then when you're the startup that could actually do something different, not to get sucked down into what is or has been done, that's a challenge.
That's totally true. And I don't think we don't do any of that as well. I think there's a need for us to start with automation and then move into optimization. So, for example, when we look at one of our customers we have at Arbiter, when we first went in, it was really about automation in order for them to lower their operational costs. They had a call center, and they were doing calls for scheduling, right? So first things first is, can we meet the expectations by automating in order for them to lower those operational costs? Well, from there, then we don't want to rest on, okay, well, we're getting X percent conversion into scheduling. We want to think about, okay, this population not only needs this right now, but we also are looking at the rest of their care journey and thinking, what else can we optimize along their care journey now that we have them as a customer? And so we are constantly looking at ways to optimize not just the single point of care to move appointments from 60% conversion to 95% conversion, but also what other comorbidities does this patient have? What else can we do based off of the record that we have for them?
You mentioned you've seen, I mean, you've been in the industry within healthcare for a very long time. So if somebody wants to go look you up, they could definitely do that. I mean, you definitely have this experience within the space. If you're looking at just the evolution in the last, let's say 5 years, we won't go further back, but just the last 5 years, and then comparing that to this discussion around AI and agentic and what it can do. And the reason I'm going to ask a question here at some point, but the reason I ask is sometimes I'm talking to people and it's like, it's not necessarily the technology that is there that's helping us solve what we couldn't. Sometimes it's us having to be forced to re-examine what we did. And you've kind of alluded to this. Obviously the technology might help us in some ways because it gives us different capabilities. But as you've kind of looked in the last, the time you spent in healthcare, we'll just leave it at that. Are you seeing AI solving problems that we potentially couldn't, or is it a case that it's solving some of the business problems and we just have new capabilities? I mean, it could be a little bit of both as well.
I mean, I'm seeing AI, especially, I'm seeing AI make some huge leaps in things that we couldn't do before. So, for example, during COVID, provider messaging shot up, I think 2-3x what it was pre-COVID levels. But the number of patients they see didn't change, right? So that behavior alone meant that providers were spending many more hours per day and per week working, and it's burning providers out. And solving for that is incredibly difficult, right? Because you can't stop patients from sending messages. There's conversations in the healthcare system that we would, folks would start to charge for those messages, but then patients, being charged for messages is very tricky. So overnight, with the move to AI, you can actually read all those messages, you can respond to those messages, and suddenly a challenge that was many provider groups were facing suddenly either goes away or gets much smaller. So I think across the system, healthcare is seeing a lot of benefits from AI. I think the thing that I always want to keep in mind as we're building across the board is that in healthcare, technology is not necessarily the product. The product is the care provided to the patient, the experience between the provider and the patient. That is always number one, number two, and number three in NPS scores across healthcare system, is whether people felt seen and cared for by their provider. And so when we're building technology, we are thinking about how does this improve the care experience, the care product for patients and providers. And in the case of Arbiter, we're thinking about how do we do that in the context of the healthcare system that we have that includes multiple stakeholders.
That's very interesting. I love it. I guess maybe final question. When you're kind of thinking about the solution, you're thinking about the end consumer, and I'm not sure how closely your product potentially touches the end consumer in terms of us using it. But when you think about the end consumer in mind, and you're thinking about the various stakeholders we've talked about, who do you keep in that middle orbit? I guess because I'm sure a lot of people are listening to this and they've been hearing the complexities with multiple stakeholders. There's a lot of legacy you guys are reinventing. You got to keep maybe somebody within the middle orbit to kind of build around, or maybe you can't because you do have so many stakeholders. I'm just asking because I'm sure people who don't have that challenge building but have an end user in mind that they're potentially also thinking about would be like, who's at the center of the Arbiter like vision board? Like who or is there multiple people? Maybe it is multiple people. It can't just be one.
I think the right thing to say would be just the patient in the middle. But in order to build the right product that actually serves the patient the best, it has to be a trifecta across payer, provider, and patient. You see enough companies out there that focus just on the patient, and it comes and it goes. And so we need to make sure that we are considering all three. That being said, when you build amazing products for the patient and you consider cost and you consider health outcomes, it oftentimes has a rippling effect across the system. And it's the thing that drives me, it's the thing that drives my team, because we all are patients and we all care the most about our experiences.
That's really, when I asked the question, I was like, I'm curious how easy, it's easy said than done, but everything you've spoken about, it just makes you aware how complicated it's one of the largest industries, period. So it's never going to be easy. And I really appreciate you coming on and sharing with us, because I think if somebody doesn't have the depth in healthcare, you completely painted a picture of some of the challenges and some of the solutions coming, and some agentic as well. If somebody does have a follow-up question, I might not have gotten to ask you everything, obviously, but is there a good way of connecting, asking a follow-up, or just learning more?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. We're also at arbiter.ai, so either of those will work.
Awesome. I definitely appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for sharing with us.
Thank you so much, Amir. Take care.
Absolutely. All right, that's it for this episode. We'll be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. I think Anjali did a great job of explaining, if you didn't have the depth of understanding within the healthcare system space, the different stakeholders, the tension between them, as it were, and how you actually bring a solution to the table that balances all those out. I think we did a great job, and she did a great job of talking to us about that. If you did enjoy the episode, please share this with somebody else who might also. I love that. Also, like, subscribe, comment. Let me know how the show is going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.